So, if you haven't heard, I'm Brazilian, and this is one of our sodas in Brazil. It's made with a fruit called guaraná, which only grows in the Amazon. And there are many different, how do you call it? There are many, I wouldn't say many, there are several brands. This one is the best. So, if you ever feel like driving to some obscure Brazilian store and buying overpriced soda because it all has to be imported, that's the one for you. I think the closest approximation I've tried yet is Balls, Bawls. If you're in the gaming community, you already know about it, but this is amazing. And it's an energy drink. And I can pretend like it's good for me because it's made with fruit. Sure. It's just as bad as any other soda. Sorry, it's late. I've had lab tonight. I'm tired, but I still have to read at least for an hour. So if I'm going to have to do this, maybe someone else wants to do this with me? Okay, let's get going. I think we left off on page 278. We just finished 277. And this starts 72C, the majority influence. So let's get going. Yeah. All right. God, I've got to stop drinking energy drinks before doing this. I told myself yesterday I wouldn't do this. Anyway, okay. Realizing that people often succumb to pressure from peers is only a first step in understanding the process of social influence. The next step is to identify the situational and personal factors that make us more or less likely to conform. We know that people tend to follow when the social pressure is intense and when they are insecure about how to behave. But what creates these feelings of pressure and insecurity? Here, we look at 4 factors: the size of the group, focus on the norms, the presence of an ally, and gender. So I think that's pretty, yep. What creates these feelings of pressure and insecurity? 4 factors. All right. And maybe the line about identifying the situational and personal factors that make us more or less likely to conform. Yeah. Okay, so thus far I see 4. The group size, like they were talking about, the focus on norms, an ally, and gender differences. So let's get cracking. Group size, the power in numbers. Common sense would suggest that as the number of other people in a majority increases, so should their impact. Actually, it's not that simple. Ashen, 1956, varied the sizes of groups using 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, or 15 Confederates. And he found that conformity increased with group size, but only up to a point. Once there were 3 or 4 Confederates, the amount of additional influence exerted by the rest was negligible. So 3 or 4 is the sweet spot. Yeah. I think I'm going to highlight that last sentence. Once there were 3 or 4, any additional influence was negligible. Okay, so other researchers went on to obtain similar results. In a recent online experiment, for example, Egbark and Ekstrom, I think that's how you say it. In 2018, they varied the number of likes accompanying a friend's Facebook news and found that more participants similarly indicated liking in response to 3 others than only 1. Beyond the presence of 3 or 4 others, however, additions to a group are subject to the law of diminishing returns. As we will see later, Bib Latane in 1981 likens the influence of people on an individual to the way light bulbs illuminate a surface. When a second light bulb is added to a room, the effect is dramatic. When the 10th bulb is added, however, its impact is barely felt, if at all. Economists say the same about the perception of money. An additional dollar seems greater to the person who only has 3 than it does to the person who has 300. Yeah. If you've ever been tipped by someone that's super, super wealthy before, I don't know if you've ever done service industry or anything. I think I think everyone should be mandated to work in the service industry to grow some compassion for others. But if you've ever been tipped by someone who's ultra wealthy, who acts like $100, I wipe my butt with $100. Yeah, it'll just bring a whole new perspective on this statement right here. Anyway. Yeah. Okay, so I think just subject to the law of diminishing returns. I don't think anything else needs to be highlighted. All right, so another possible explanation is that another possible explanation is that more and more people express the same opinion. I can't read today. Oh my God, guys. Okay, another possible explanation is that as more and more people express the same opinion, an individual is likely to suspect that they're acting either in collusion or as a spineless sheep. According to David Wilder in 1977, what matters is not the actual number of others in the group, but rather one's perception of how many distinct others who are thinking independently the group includes. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. What matters is not the actual number of others in the group, but rather one's perception of how many distinct others who are thinking independently in the group includes. Okay. Indeed, Wilder found that people were more influenced by 2 groups of 2 than by 1 4-person group, and by 2 groups of 3 than by 1 6-person group. So conformity increased even more when people were exposed to 3 2-person groups. When faced with a majority opinion, we do more than just count the number of warm bodies. We try to assess the number of independent minds.
Am I right? Very nice. How much?
And sorry, my husband. Anyway, sorry, he was just passing by. Focus, Michelle, focus. I think in this sentence, or in this paragraph, as more people express the same opinion, an individual is likely to suspect they're either that, and then when faced with a majority opinion, we try to assess the number of independent minds. The first and last sentences. Okay, so past group size. We're now looking at the focus on norms. The size of a majority may influence the amount of pressure that is felt, but social norms give rise to conformity only when we know the norms and focus on them. This may sound like an obvious point, yet we often misperceive what is normative, particularly when others are too afraid or too embarrassed to publicly present their true thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. That makes sense. If you aren't aware of something, or if people don't speak up, then you have a silent majority. That just makes sense. So whoever's loudest, most often, is perceived as the majority, even if they don't have the numbers. Yeah, I like that. Social norms give rise to conformity only when we know the norms and focus on them, and yet we often misperceive what is normative, particularly when others are too afraid or too embarrassed to publicly present them. Yeah. All right, so one common example of this pluralistic ignorance concerns perceptions of alcohol usage in a number of college-wide surveys. Deborah Prentice and Dale Miller in 1996 found that most students overestimated how comfortable their peers were with the level of drinking on campus. Those who overestimated how others felt about drinking at the start of the school year eventually conformed to this misperception in their own attitudes and behavior. In contrast, students who took part in discussion sessions that were designed to correct these misperceptions actually consumed less alcohol 6 months later. These findings are important. Additional research has shown that both male and female students tend to overestimate how frequently their same-sex peers use various substances and the quantities they consume. Whether the substance in question is alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, or marijuana, the more normative students perceive peer usage to be, the more they consume. Interesting. I think that last one. Yeah. The more normative students perceive peer usage to be, the more they consume. Okay. Across a range of situations and intervention purposes, changing people's perceptions of norms can be used to change their behavior. In fact, social mobilization, defined as any effort to marshal large groups to sacrifice time, effort, and money to achieve a social purpose. Yep, I'm going to highlight that. That's a definition. It requires that individuals believe that the behavior is normative. Whether the goal is to get people to vote, volunteer time, sign a petition, attend a rally, conserve energy, recycle, or make a charitable contribution, people are more likely to mobilize if they believe that others, particularly similar others, will do the same. Yep. I think, that whole thing requires that individuals believe that the behavior is normative. Yep. Summarizing. Woo! Okay, so an ally in dissent, getting by with a little help. In Ash's initial experiment, unwitting participants found themselves pitted against unanimous majorities. But what if they had an ally, a partner in dissent? Ash investigated this issue and found that the presence of a single Confederate who agreed with the participant reduced conformity by almost 80%. This finding, however, does not tell us why the presence of an ally was so effective. Was it because he or she agreed with the participant, or because he or she disagreed with the majority? In other words, were the views of the participants strengthened because a dissenting Confederate offered validating information, or because dissent per se reduced normative pressures? If someone else is dissenting, I can dissent too. I think the best way to test that is to have 3 options, or even 4, whatever, and have the majority pick the wrong one. And then you have the participant who's like, should I? And then they have one participant out who dissents from the majority and instead of picking the correct answer, they pick another wrong answer. That would be an easy way to test whether it's just because they're going against the normal. So I feel like I can go against the normal, even though we don't agree. Or if it's because of the other way. Oh, they agreed with me on mine, so my answer must be right kind of situation. Yeah, I think that's the best way to test for that. Maybe they did do that. I'm just talking my head off and not reading. Okay. All right, so a series of experiments explored these two possibilities. In one, Vernon Allen and John Levine in 1969 led participants to believe that they were working together with 4 Confederates. 3 of these others consistently agreed on the wrong judgment. The 4th then followed the majority, agreed with the participant, or made a 3rd judgment, which was incorrect. Just like I said. Oh! Okay, so this last variation was the most interesting. Even when the Confederate did not validate their own judgment, participants conformed less often to the majority. Sorry. That's just so self-affirming. Anyway, okay. In another experiment, Allen and Levine in 1971 varied the competence of the ally. Some participants received support from an average person. In contrast, others found themselves supported by someone who wore very thick glasses and complained that he could not see the visual displays. Not a very reassuring ally. Right? Wrong. Even though participants derived less comfort from this supporter than from one who seemed more competent at the task, his presence still reduced their level of conformity. 2 important conclusions follow from this research. First, it is substantially more difficult for people to stand alone for their convictions than to be part of even a tiny minority. Yep, that's getting highlighted. Second, any dissent, whether it validates an individual's opinion or not, can break the spell cast by a unanimous majority and reduce the normative pressures to conform. Boom, that's getting highlighted too. An interesting possible illustration of how uncommon it is for individuals to single-handedly oppose a majority, researchers examined voting patterns on the U.S. Supreme Court from 1953 all the way to 2001. Table 7.2 shows that out of the 4,178 decisions in which all 9 justices voted so just votes that had all 9 justices vote, because sometimes they abstain, right? Or they're saying, I'm not removed enough from the situation or this case to be able to give a objective opinion on it, so I'm going to abstain from the vote on it. Yeah, of all the vote breakdowns, they're saying the 8-to-1 split was the least frequent, and it only occurred 10% of the time in those however many years, almost 50 years. That's crazy. That's insane. All right, I don't need to highlight anything else from there. Now we get to gender differences and we can move on. All right. So are there gender differences in conformity? Based on Ash's initial studies, social psychologists used to think that women, once considered the weaker sex, conform more than men. In light of all the research, however, it appears that 2 additional factors have to be considered. First, sex differences depend on how comfortable people are with the experimental task. In a classic study, Frank Sistrunk and John McDavid in 1971 had male and female participants answer questions on stereotypically masculine, feminine, and gender-neutral topics. Along with each question, participants were told the percentage of others who agreed or disagreed. Although females conformed to the contrived majority more on masculine items, males conformed more on feminine items. There were no sex differences on the neutral questions. This finding suggests that one's familiarity with the issue at hand, not gender, is what affects conformity. That sentence. That's the one. All right, a second factor is the type of social situation people face. As a general rule, gender differences are weak and unreliable, but there is an important exception. In face-to-face encounters, where people must agree with each other openly, small differences do emerge. And I'm going to highlight that. An important exception. Small differences do emerge. Okay. In fact, when participants think they're being observed, women conform more and men conform less than they do in a more private situation. Why does being in public create such a divergence in behavior? Alice Eagley in 1987 argues that in front of others, people worry how they come across and feel pressured to behave in ways that are viewed as acceptable according to traditional gender role constraints. At least in public, men feel pressured to behave with fierce independence and autonomy, whereas women are expected to play a gentler, more harmonious role. Okay. In front of others, people worry about how they come across and feel pressured to behave in ways that are acceptable according to gender role constraints. From an evolutionary perspective, Vladas Griskevicius, I think. Griskevicius? I don't know, man. It looks Latin. I could be wrong. Anyway, Vladas, this guy, and others in 2006 suggest that people are most likely to behave in gender stereotyped ways when motivated to attract someone of the opposite sex. Consistent with the stereotypic notion that women tend to like men who distinguish themselves as independent and dominant, whereas men prefer women who are agreeable and cooperative, their research shows that women conform more and that men conform less when primed to think about themselves in a romantic situation specifically. But here's the interesting part. When Matthew Hornsey and others in 2015 asked people in a series of experiments to indicate their personal preferences for a romantic partner, both men and women alike were attracted to others who are nonconformists. This pairing of results begs the question, why did female participants in the first study present themselves as conformists to attract a male partner, when men in the second set of studies consistently expressed a preference for nonconformist women? Although more research is needed, these studies seem to suggest that women harbor the belief that men like conformist women, a belief grounded in the past that may well turn out to be a myth. And I think also generation makes a huge difference. They're not touching on that. Culture between what was socially sought after 20, 30 years ago is not the same as now. I mean, they're not talking about that big of a difference. This Vladas guy did his study in 2006, and Matthew Hornsey did his in 2015. So that's almost a 10-year difference, but that's a generation. Like, the people who were dating in 2006 are not the same people who are dating today, or I hope not, unless they really like to date. And you know what? Good on you. But in general, younger generations are looking for a different thing than older generations. And older generations, I feel, still had some of that hue from a few generations past that said you have to prescribe to a certain way to present yourself. This is what guys are attracted to. And we're really, really attuned, fine-tuned to seeing what is attractive, what is not attractive. And then you can go into various different groups, like what would be seen as attractive to men in a Orthodox or traditional conservative Calvinist church here in Texas is going to be different than what men in, I don't know, it's a good example. Men in the gaming community, no, maybe not the gaming community. What's diametrically opposed? Guys in, I don't know. I don't know. Just somewhere else, like guys in LA who aren't religious. They're not going to go for the same people, right? At least that's what I postulate. Even amongst the same age. I think culture makes a huge difference, and gender or generation is a different cultural aspect that I don't think gets enough consideration. So yeah, I absolutely do believe those women at the time harbored a belief that men liked conformist women. But to say that women still think that and that it wasn't what men thought at that time versus today is I think presumptuous. Let's get back to it, shall we? All right, so 7-2D was talking about minority influence. So we've talked about majority influence. We've talked about why people conform, the early classics. Yeah, now we're going to talk about minority. So in a book titled Dissent in Dangerous Times by Austin Surratt in 2005, he noted that while the freedom to dissent is highly valued in the American national psyche, individual dissenters are often vilified for their beliefs, especially in today's post-9/11 war on terrorism. It has never been easy for individuals to express unpopular views and enlist support for these views from others. Philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "Conventional people are roused to frenzy by departure from convention, largely because they regard such departure as criticism of themselves." Oh, damn, that's good. I'm going to highlight that. If that didn't hit you hard, are you even alive? Just kidding. Oh my gosh, I'm going to read that again. Philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "Conventional people are roused to frenzy by the departure from convention, largely because they regard such departure as criticism of themselves." Never was there a truer statement. Dang. Okay. I'm going to have to chew on that later. So, anyway, he may have been right. Although people who assert their beliefs against the majority are generally seen as competent and honest, they're also disliked and roundly rejected. It's no wonder that most people think twice before expressing unpopular positions. In a series of survey studies of what he called the minority slowness effect, John Basili in 2003 asked people about their attitudes on social policy issues, such as affirmative action, or about their likes and dislikes for various celebrities, sports, foods, places, and activities. Consistently, and regardless of the topic, respondents who held minority opinions were slower to answer the questions than those in the majority. Yep, that's getting highlighted. I think I'm also going to highlight the last sentence of the last paragraph too. They're also disliked and roundly rejected. Okay, so resisting the pressure to conform and maintaining one's independence may be socially difficult, but it's not impossible. History's most famous heroes, villains, and creative minds are living proof. Think Joan of Arc, Jesus Christ, Galileo, Charles Darwin, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, to name an admirable few, were dissenters of their time who continue to capture the imagination. Then there is human behavior in the laboratory. Social psychologists have been so intrigued by Ash's initial finding that participants conformed 37% of the time that textbooks, such as this one, routinely refer to Ash's conformity study. Why do I have a feeling this is going to be critical? This whole study. I think I'm going to go back and put that study in my notes. They've made a point to bring it up so many times. Yet, the overlooked flip side of the coin is that Ash's participants refused to acquiesce 63% of the time, thus also indicating the power of independence. So, I think I'm going to highlight that first sentence. It might be socially difficult, but not impossible. 12 Angry Men, a classic film. Oh man, I've seen the play. It's good. If you haven't watched it or anything, watch it. It's potent. Okay. It illustrates how a lone dissenter can resist the pressure to conform and convince others to follow. Almost as soon as the door of the jury room closes, the jury in this film takes a show of hands vote. The result is 11-1. Majority in favor of conviction, with Fonda the lone holdout. Through 90 minutes of heated deliberation, Fonda works relentlessly to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of his peers. In the end, the jury reaches a unanimous verdict, not guilty. Sometimes art imitates life. Sometimes it does not. In this instance, Henry Fonda's heroics are highly atypical. When it comes to jury decision-making, as we'll see in Chapter 12, the majority usually wins. Yet, in trial juries, as in other small groups, there are occasional exceptions where the minorities prevail, as when someone from the majority faction defects. Thanks to Sergei Moscovici and others, we now know quite a bit about minority influence and the strategies that astute nonconformists use to act as agents of social change. I think that last sentence, we now know quite a bit about strategies. Yeah, and that's also a key term. So lots of highlighting. All right. So Moscovici's theory is that according to him, majorities are powerful by virtue of their sheer numbers, whereas nonconformists derive power from the style of their behavior. That seems like it's gonna be important. So it's not just what nonconformists say that matters, but how they say it. To exert influence, says Moscovici, those in the minority must be forceful, persistent, and unwavering in support of their position. To exert influence, that whole sentence also seems really, really important. Okay, yet at the same time, they must appear flexible and open-minded. Dang it, I'm going to end up highlighting this whole paragraph. Confronted with a consistent but even-handed dissenter, members of the majority will sit up, take notice, and rethink their positions. So why should a consistent behavioral style prove effective? One possible reason is that unwavering repetition draws attention from those in the mainstream. Unwavering repetition draws attention from those in the mainstream, which is a necessary first step in social influence. Another possibility is that consistency signals the dissenter is unlikely to yield, which leads those in the majority to feel pressure to seek compromise. It signals that the dissenter is unlikely to yield and to seek compromise. Okay. A third possible reason is that when confronted with someone who has the self-confidence and dedication to take an unpopular stand without backing down, people assume that he or she must have a point. Merit. Confronted with someone who has self-confidence, all the way to must have a point. Yeah. Of course, it helps to be seen as part of us rather than them. Research shows that dissenters have more influence when people identify with them and perceive them to be similar in ways that are relevant and desirable. Okay. When people identify them and perceive them in similar ways that are relevant and desirable. Okay. So they've essentially said 4 things. Help with minorities overriding the power of the majority. And that's unwavering repetition. Pressuring them to seek compromise from your unyielding nature. Showing so much self-confidence and dedication that people give you authority or not give you authority, but they see you as an expert. They give you that rank or the benefit of the doubt. And when they see similarity between the two of you. Okay, that makes sense. All right. So based on a meta-analysis of 97 experiments investigating minority influence, Wendy Wood and her colleagues in 1994 concluded that there is strong support for the consistency hypothesis. In a classic study, Moscovici and others in 1969 turned Ash's procedure on its head by confronting people with a minority of Confederates who made incorrect judgments. Oh, that's interesting. In groups of 6, participants took part in what was supposedly a study of color perception. They viewed a series of slides that all were blue, but varied in intensity. For each slide, the participants took turns naming the color. The task was simple, but 2 Confederates announced that the slides were green. When the Confederates were consistent, that is, when both made incorrect green judgments for all slides, they had a surprising degree of influence. About a third of all participants incorrectly reported seeing at least one green slide. Interesting. And 8% of all respondents, and 8 of all responses were incorrect. Subsequent research confirmed that the perception of consistency increases minority influence. Yep, subsequent research increases minority influence. Yep, that whole thing. Cool. Noting that social dissent can also breed hostility. Edwin Hollander in 1958 commented or recommended a different approach. Hollander warned that people who seek positions of leadership or challenge a group without first becoming accepted, full-fledged members of that group, that they run the risk that their opinions will fall on deaf ears. He warned that people who seek positions of leadership without first becoming accepted full-fledged members of the group run the risk that their opinions will fall on deaf ears. I'm not going to get political, but I've seen that in politics, yes. Okay, as an alternative to Moscovici's consistency strategy, Hollander suggested that to influence a majority, people should first conform in order to establish their credentials as competent insiders. By becoming members of the mainstream, they accumulate idiosyncrasy credits, brownie points. That's getting highlighted. Once they have accumulated enough goodwill within the group, a certain amount of their deviance will then be tolerated. Several studies have shown that this first conform, then dissent strategy, like the consistent dissent approach, can be effective. I like consistency better, but that's just me. Okay, so processes and outcomes of minority influence. Regardless of which strategy is used, minority influence is a force to be reckoned with. But does it work just like conformity? Or is there something different about the way minorities and majorities affect change? Some theorists have proposed that a single process accounts for both directions of social influence, that minority influence is like a chip off the old block. Others have taken a dual process approach. In this second view, majorities and minorities exert influence in different ways and for different reasons. Majorities because they have power and control. They elicit public conformity by bringing stressful normative pressures to bear on the individual. But minorities, because they are seen as seriously committed to their views, produce a deeper and more lasting form of private conformity or conversion by leading others to become curious and rethink their original positions. Okay, so I'm going to highlight the sentence about some theorists have proposed a single process, that the minority is similar, chip off the old block, and majorities have, because they have power and control, elicit public conformity all the way to the end of the paragraph. Those two last sentences. Yeah. So to evaluate the single and dual process theories, researchers have compared the effects of majority and minority viewpoints on participants who are otherwise neutral on an issue. On the basis of this research, two conclusions can be drawn. First, the relative impact of majorities and minorities depends on whether the judgment that is being made is objective or subjective, a matter of fact or opinion. In a study conducted in Italy, Anne Maz and others in 1996 found that majorities have greater influence on factual questions for which only one answer is correct. What percentage of its oil does Italy import from Venezuela? Is an example. But that minorities exert equal impact on opinion questions for which there is a range of acceptable responses. What percentage of its raw oil should Italy import from Venezuela? Would be a better question for opinion. Okay, so people feel freer to stray from the mainstream on matters of opinion when there is no right or wrong answer. So relevant right now. I'm going to highlight that. And the sentence that said they found that majorities have greater influence on factual questions for which there is only one answer. Yeah, that is correct. Okay, so the second conclusion is that the relative effects of majority and minority points of view depend on how and when conformity is measured. To be sure, majorities have a decisive upper hand on direct or public measures of conformity. After all, people are reluctant to oppose a group norm in a conspicuous manner. But on more indirect or private measures of conformity, on attitude issues that are related but not focal to the point of conflict, or after the passage of time, all of which softens the extent to which majority participants would appear deviant, then minorities exert a strong impact. As Moscovici cogently argued, each of us is changed in a meaningful but subtle way by majority opinion. Oh man, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to highlight majorities have decisive upper hand on direct, but minorities exert a strong impact, but on more indirect or private measures of conformity. And then I'm just going to highlight minorities exert a strong impact. They put a lot in the middle that I don't think is important. Yeah, okay. So, in Rogues, Rebels, and Dissent, just because everyone agrees doesn't mean they're right, by Charlene Nemeth in 2016. That's a good book title. I'm just going to say that. Okay. He reviews more than 30 years of research indicating that dissenters in a group serve an invaluable purpose. Regardless of whether their views are correct, dissenters may feel like a nuisance, she notes. Oh, Charlene's girl. My bad. Dissenters may feel like a nuisance. Dissenters may feel like a nuisance, she notes, but an unnecessary source of conflict. Oh, and Nope, I'm going to power through it. Just punch through the wall, honey bunny. Okay. And an unnecessary source of conflict, forcing others to defend a position that everyone else agrees with. Yet, research shows that dissent sparks innovation. I'm going to highlight that. Research shows that dissent sparks innovation. Simply by their willingness to stay firmly independent, minorities can force other group members to think more carefully, more openly, in new and different ways, and more creatively about a problem, enhancing the quality of a group's output. In one study, participants exposed a minority viewpoint on how to solve anagram problems, later found more novel solutions themselves. In a second study, those exposed to a consistent minority viewpoint on how best to recall information later recalled more words from a list that they were trying to memorize. And in a third study, interacting groups with one dissenting Confederate produced more original analyses of complex business problems. Importantly, Nemeth and her colleagues in 2001 found that to have influence over a group, lone individuals must exhibit authentic dissent, not merely play devil's advocate, a tactic that usually just bolsters a majority's position. Yeah, if they feel like, no, I'll go with the flow. I just want to argue for argument's sake. Then they're not even going to listen to you. That totally makes sense. I'm going to highlight that. Lone individuals must exhibit authentic dissent, not merely, which can bolster it. I think I'm going to highlight that first sentence. Minorities can force other group members to think more carefully, more openly, new and in different ways, enhancing the group's output. Yeah, that whole thing. Okay. So, let's continue. Now we're at 7.2e, culture and conformity. We humans are a heterogeneous genus. Genius? Heterogeneous? You know you're tired when. Okay, we humans are heterogeneous and diverse lot. Are a heterogeneous and diverse lot. God, why can't I talk today? As a matter of geography, some of us live in large, heavily populated cities where others live in small towns, affluent suburbs, rural farming or fishing communities, jungles, expansive deserts, high altitude mountains, tropical islands, and vast Arctic plains. Including dialects, we have more than 6,500 languages spoken. There are also hundreds of religions that people identify with, the most common being Christianity, 33%, and Islam at 21%, Hinduism at 14%, Chinese traditional 6%, Buddhism 6%, Judaism at 0.22%, and others claiming fewer adherents. Roughly 16% of the world's population is not affiliated with a religion at all. Linked together by time and space. Each culture has its own ideology, its own music, fashions, food, laws, customs, and manners of expression. As many tourists and exchange students traveling abroad have come to learn, sometimes the hard way, the social norms that influence human contact can vary in significant ways from one part of the world to another. In Do's and Taboos Around the World, Roger Axtell in 1993 warns world travelers about some of these differences. Dine in an Indian home, he notes, and you should leave food on the plate to show the host that the portions were generous and you've had enough to eat. Yet, as a dinner guest in Bolivia, you would show your appreciation by cleaning your plate. Shop in an outdoor market in Iraq, and you should expect to negotiate the price of everything you buy. Plan an appointment in Brazil, and the person you're scheduled to meet is likely to be late. It's nothing personal, and really it's not. 90% of the population lives on the coast in extremely compact conditions. Most of us live in high-rises on the beach. And, the rest of the country is fairly wild and unlived in. Or if there are pockets of people who live in there, they're like isolated. Like Wyoming, isolated. Anyway. The point is, when you have that many people packed in together in tiny cities, living all in skyrises, there's massive traffic. So if you make appointments with people for a certain time and you expect them to be on time, you're not being very gracious either. Give them some grace. They're probably going to be late. Sorry, that was just the Brazilian in me justifying. I'm going to shut up now. All right. In North America, it is common to sit casually opposite someone with your legs outstretched. Yet in Nepal, as in many Muslim countries, it's an insult to point the bottoms of your feet at someone. Even the way we space ourselves from each other is influenced by culture. Americans, Canadians, British, and Northern Europeans keep a polite distance between themselves and others and feel crowded by the touchier, nose-to-nose style of French, Greek, Arabs, most of the people living in South America, Mexico. In the affairs of day-to-day living, each culture operates by its own rules of conduct. Just as cultures differ in their social norms, so too they differ in the extent to which people are expected to adhere to those norms. As we saw in Chapter 3, there are different cultural orientations toward persons and their relationships to groups. Some cultures primarily value individualism and the virtues of independence, autonomy, and self-reliance, whereas others value collectivism and the virtues of interdependence, cooperation, and social harmony. Key terms. Under a banner of individualism, personal goals take priority over group allegiances. Yet, in collectivistic cultures, the person is first and foremost a loyal member of a family, city, team, company, church, or state. What determines whether a culture becomes individualistic or collectivistic, speculating on the origins of these orientations, Harry Triandis in 1985 suggested that there are 3 key factors of how they became these two. Okay, sure. Yeah, I think that's the first thing I'm going to highlight. What determines whether culture becomes? 3 key factors. First is the complexity of the society. Highlight. As people come to live in more complex industrialized societies, compared, for example, with a simpler life of food gathering among desert nomads, there are more groups to identify with, which means less loyalty to any one group and a greater focus on personal rather than collective goals. Yeah, but China's massive and they have a collectivistic society. I don't know, maybe they address that. Second is the affluence of a society. Highlight. As people prosper, they gain financial independence from others, a condition that promotes social independence as well as mobility and a focus on personal rather than collective goals. The third factor is heterogeneity. Highlight. Societies that are homogeneous. That's how you say it. Lord, what is wrong with me, guys? Homogeneous. Societies that are homogeneous or tight, where members share the same language, religion, social customs, tend to be rigid and intolerant of those who veer from the norm. Societies that are culturally diverse or loose, where 2 or more cultures can coexist, tend to be more permissive of dissent, thus allowing for more individual expression. According to Edward Sampson in 2000, cultural orientations may also be rooted in religious ideologies, as in the link between Christianity and individualism. Early research, I'm going to say, may also be rooted in religious ideologies. Yeah. All right, early research across nations showed that autonomy and independence, oh my gosh, it's midnight, guys. Okay, let's just get through this. I only got 2 more pages, or maybe 3. Oh, let's do this. Early research across nations showed that autonomy and independence were most highly valued in the United States, Australia, Great Britain, Canada, and the Netherlands, in that order. In contrast, other cultures value social harmony and fitting in for the sake of community. The most collectivistic the most collectivist people being Venezuela, Colombia, Pakistan, Peru, Taiwan, and China. Although research shows that the differences are even more complicated than individuals differ within cultures. Are even more complicated, that individuals differ even within cultures, and that cultures change over time, it is clear that nations, on average, vary in their orientations on the dimension of individualism. The difference can be measured in books and other written materials by the contents of the stories told and the use of the first person singular pronouns, I and me. Okay, so nations on average vary in their orientations on the dimension of individualism, and that the difference can be measured in books and other written materials by the contents of the stories told and the use of first-person singular pronouns. All right. So, do cultural orientations influence conformity? Among the Bantu of Zimbabwe, an African people in which deviance is scored, 51% of participants who were placed in an ASH-like study conformed, more than the number typically seen in the United States. When John Barry compared participants from 17 cultures, he found that conformity rates changed from low of 18% among Inuit hunters of the Baffin Island to a high of 60% among village-dwelling Temne farmers in West Africa. Additional analyses have shown that conformity rates are generally higher in cultures that are collectivistic rather than individualistic in orientation. Hence, many anthropologists interested in human culture and its influence over individuals study the processes of conformity and independence. So, that second to last sentence. Analyses have shown that conformity rates are generally higher in cultures that are collectivistic rather than individualistic. Even within collectivistic cultures, the pressure to conform can vary in subtle ways. For example, consider Japan and Turkey. Both cultures emphasize interdependence and connectedness to others. Yet, while Japanese culture stresses fitting in, Turkish culture stresses sticking together. So when Derya Gungur and others in 2014 asked students in each country to report on their daily interactions, Japanese participants tended to talk about conformity. You know, I go along with what others want, even if I would rather do something different. While Turkish participants focused more on relatedness. I consider people who are close to me as an important part of who I am. Even within collectivistic cultures, pressure to conform can vary in subtle ways. I think that's the most important. All right, I know I said I was going to do 11 pages each day, but we're about to start compliance on this page, and I would rather do that in one sitting than break it up. So that puts an additional 2 pages on me. 2, maybe 3 pages on me. It'll be fine. Yeah, it'll be fine. I'll figure it out. That'll be fine. If only they made this easier. All right. I'm tired. I'm going to go to bed. And I'm going to do the next video when I'm not so tired. I'll see you guys later. Bye.